Well, right after Jesus has this mountainside experience where he calls his disciples and he begins to make them into the church, they find themselves in this next story in the book of Mark, kind of instantly faced with the mission in reality. Right? This is what it says in Mark chapter 3. It says, "Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, 'He's out of his mind.' And the teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem said, 'He's possessed by Beelzebub, by the prince of demons, he's driving out demons.' And so Jesus called them over to him, and he began to speak to them in parables. Jesus said, 'How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. In fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. Truly, I tell you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. They are guilty of eternal sin.' And he said this because they were saying he has an impure spirit. Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him, and a crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, 'Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you.' 'Who are my mother and brothers?' Jesus asked. And then he looked at those seated in the circle around him and said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brothers and sisters and mother.'" It's a really interesting story because there's a lot of concepts that kind of just sort of converge in on this one event that happens in the life of Jesus Christ, right? Jesus and his disciples are surrounded by such a huge crowd of people that they're serving and they're feeding and they're healing and they're driving out demons and they're really connecting all of these people to who God is, right? That's what they're doing. In fact, the work was so big and there were so many people, they didn't even have time to stop and eat. It was just one right after the other. And in the midst of this moment where Jesus and his disciples are carrying out this mission of God, these two groups come by. And they try to put a stop to what they think is complete madness, right? The first group is Jesus' family. They come by and they're concerned that Jesus and his disciples, they're giving too much of themselves. "You must be beside yourself," is what they say, because they're giving up so much of themselves and putting all these people first. The second group that comes by are the Pharisees, right? And they're more concerned that Jesus is driven by some sort of evil force, that he's got some kind of demonic force that is trying to gain authority through manipulation and working his way that way. So they're really skeptical of what Jesus is doing. It's incredible the parallels that you can draw straight from this story into today. I mean, when you put yourself like in the role of Christian, which we are, the fact that Christians desire to put themselves aside and to serve Jesus by serving the world sounds insane to people, right? It sounds insane to people outside of the church, but it even sounds a little weird to people who are inside the church, right? Outside the church, the world is trying to figure out what's your angle. Are you just trying to get my money? What is it that you're trying to do? You just want political favor or whatever it is. Like inside the church, people are like, "Hey, that's fine if you want to go serve, you want to go do, but just leave my Sunday morning alone," right? There's groups on both sides of the line that haven't fully wrapped themselves around this complete sacrificial missional love that Jesus calls us to, and that he and his disciples were participating there in this story. But here Jesus is, nevertheless, right in the middle of this tug of war between people inside and outside, back and forth. And what is he doing but busily feeding the hungry and healing people and bringing people back from the dead? I mean, it's completely countercultural what Jesus is doing. It's completely countercultural who he calls us to be as a church. And that's what makes people skeptical, is because it is upstream from the flow. In the midst of this tug of war match, Jesus proclaims something that is so incredibly important to us all, right? He says, look, we can stay divided on these worldly issues, or we can be united on eternal issues. In fact, what Jesus tries to illustrate in this story is that for all of us, no sin is too great for the grace of God. Unless we just flat out reject that grace altogether, there is no sin that is too great. And all of us, inside and outside, all men sin and fall short of the glory of God, and all men are justified freely by his grace through the redemption offered by Jesus Christ. I mean, that's the great uniter for us all. That's the great uniter for us all as we step into the mission of peace of the church. That all of us are saved freely by Jesus Christ.